The chill of the Russian summer night clung to the earth, masking the bitter truth that, beneath the mist, thousands of men poised for what would become the greatest armored clash in history. Kursk, July 1943, was more than just a battlefield. It was a canvas where the fates of nations, technologies, and reputations would be painted in steel, mud, and fire. On this unassuming wedge of Ukrainian soil, German confidence was absolute, and Russian resolve, so fragile months before, would be tested beyond limits. The world had doubted the Red Army after the disasters of 1941 and 1942. Its soldiers had been dismissed as ill-equipped, poorly trained, and lacking initiative. Yet fate, as it often does, favored the unheralded, and among these men stood an artilleryman, a face in the sea of millions, who would, through doubt and daring, tilt the scales of the entire campaign. The tension that had percolated since Hitler announced Operation Citadel now threatened to burst. Intelligence on both sides was frenzied, nervous. Berlin insisted that the Panzers, masterpieces of German engineering and pride, would smash the Soviet defenses before them. In the German camps, stories swirled of Russian panic, abandoned villages, retreating troops, and the brittle shield of the motherland. But within the Soviet ranks, there was a stubborn, quiet revolution. New orders, hard lessons learned, and men, sometimes disrespected in their own batteries, who steeled themselves for a chance to prove that ingenuity could triumph over machinery. In the opening hours, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the converging barrels of hundreds of Soviet artillery pieces. Among these gunners, young Lieutenant Ivan Morozov was already uneasy. His battery, a mix of aging 76 mm divisional guns and hastily refitted howitzers, had been ordered to follow standard protocols, open up en masse, saturating the kill zones pre-assigned on the maps. Morozov, an unremarkable conscript on paper, bore the marks of someone who had survived the previous year's disasters and learned from them. His peers considered him a stickler for discipline, but also painfully methodical, a trait that, on this night, would become a double-edged sword. The Germans, led by veteran armored commanders who had steamrolled through Western Europe and across Soviet lines, advanced in their tight, doctrinal columns. Their Panzers, pride of the Reich, moved with machine-like precision, relying on formations that had decimated their enemies in past confrontations. Yet Morozov saw something else, a vulnerability. In notes scribbled into his battered field notebook, he'd obsessed over German armored doctrine, noting that their reliance on set paths and radio-directed columns might prove a fatal weakness in the maelstrom of Kursk. As the first rumble of German tanks echoed across the fields, orders blared from Soviet field telephones. Commence the barrage. Morozov hesitated, heart pounding, his artillery piece trained not on the coordinates shouted through the headset, but slightly ahead, where he suspected the true spearhead of the German thrust would attempt a breakthrough. This deviation was not just unauthorized, it was potentially treasonous. The Red Army's discipline was legendary, not only for its rigor, but for its punishments. Yet, in this moment, Morozov's long nights of observation, his familiarity with enemy habits, and the instinct of a soldier for survival compelled him to act. The guns spoke, and the earth convulsed. All across the salient, fire and steel rained onto the advancing German formations. But where most shells blanketed empty terrain or brushed only the lead elements, Morozov's mistargeted shots thundered into the blind spot between the lead and the rear vehicles, the vital bottleneck where Panzers bunched together, momentarily vulnerable before fanning out on open ground. The effect was catastrophic. In a span of mere minutes, confusion rippled through the Panzer column. Engines stalled, tank commanders barked conflicting orders, and the infamous German radio discipline dissolved into chaos as flaming hulks blocked the way forward and back. From atop his gun shield, Morozov saw through smoke and flame the very moment the German attack faltered. The invincibility of the Panzerwaffe was, for those few seconds, laid bare. Orders crackled urgently through his headset, commanding him to cease fire and realign his shots as prescribed. But Morozov, face slick with sweat, sight fixed on the growing carnage, ignored them. He adjusted again, targeting the rear of the column, and loosed a final, furious barrage. The sound was apocalyptic. Within moments, a third of the German armor had been rendered burning wreckage, the remaining crews scrambling for cover as Soviet infantry, emboldened by the sudden halt, surged forward with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails. That single, unauthorized firing pattern did not merely break the German advance, it fractured their very confidence, forcing a pause in an operation that had depended on relentless forward momentum. In headquarters across the line, Russian commanders at first cursed the undisciplined shooting, but as scouts brought news of the mangled steel and the rush of desperate German radio traffic, they began to understand. Ingenuity and the willingness to challenge orders, in that hour of peril, had won them precious time and changed the tide. For Morozov himself, the nervous hours that followed felt like years. Would he be praised as a hero or court-martialed as a traitor? His crew, recognizing the odds they had faced, rallied to his defense, forming a barricade, both literal and political, around their lieutenant. Word of the battered Panzer column soon filtered through the ranks, reaching the ears of even the highest command staff. Had fate not intervened, had Morozov followed orders to the letter, the outcome at Kursk might have been very different. In a conflict where machinery and doctrine so often seem to determine outcomes, it was one soldier's anxiety, study, and daring that carved a new legend into the tale of resistance. The rest of the night, as the rain began to fall and the German fury battered other sectors, Soviet soldiers whispered the story of the gun that defied orders and saved a front. The transformation, the pivot from ridicule to respect, from regulation to revelation, began that night, hidden beneath the autumn mist, as Soviet commanders realized that victory depended not just on steel and numbers, but on men willing to risk everything for a glimpse of hope. Morozov's gamble would inspire others across the Kursk salient, feeding a rising tide of confidence that would culminate, hours later, in the full unleashing of the Soviet counterattack. As dawn broke, the burnt-out wrecks of German panzers were silhouetted against a sky streaked with artillery smoke, a monument to both devastation and defiance. And so began the legend of the unauthorized pattern, mocked by some, feared by many, and ultimately, a catalyst for one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. As the morning sun pierced the smoke-laden horizon, the implications of Lieutenant Morozov's unauthorized barrage began to ripple outward like cracks in ice. What had started as a single gunner's desperate gamble now threatened to shatter the carefully constructed edifice of military discipline, doctrine, and hierarchy that had defined the Soviet war effort since 1941. But more importantly, it offered something the Red Army had desperately needed: proof that individual initiative could triumph over mechanized precision. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, commander of the 1st Artillery Regiment, arrived at Morozov's position within an hour of the ceasefire, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The young lieutenant stood at attention beside his smoking gun, still warm from the night's work, as his superior officer surveyed them. Carnage spread across the valley below. Twisted metal and burning fuel created a hellscape that stretched for nearly a kilometer, the remnants of what had been the pride of the 11th Panzer Division. "Explain to me, Lieutenant." Volkov's voice carried the weight of a man who had survived Stalin's purges and the disasters of 1941. "Why my orders were so casually dismissed. Why you chose to endanger the entire operation with your creativity." The word dripped with contempt, but underneath lay something else. A grudging recognition that the results spoke louder than regulations. Morozov's response would later be recorded in the divisional war diary, though heavily censored versions would circulate among the ranks for decades to come. "Comrade Colonel, I observed the enemy's movement patterns for 3 days. Their radio discipline suggested a breakthrough attempt at grid reference 234456, not the coordinates we were assigned to target. I calculated that a concentrated barrage on their forming up point would create maximum disruption." His voice barely above a whisper, hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and adrenaline. What Volkov couldn't have known, what none of the Soviet commanders could have anticipated, was that Morozov's action had achieved something far beyond the destruction of a single panzer column. German radio intercepts, decoded hours later by Soviet intelligence, revealed the panic that had spread through the 11th Panzer Division's command structure. The unexpected accuracy and timing of the Soviet fire had convinced German officers that their codes had been broken, their plans compromised at the highest levels. General von Manstein, the architect of the southern pincer of Operation Citadel, received reports that morning that would fundamentally alter his strategic calculations. The loss of nearly 40 tanks, not just destroyed, but eliminated in such a precise surgical strike, suggested a level of Soviet tactical sophistication that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible. The Russians, he would later write in his memoirs, had somehow acquired not just the means to resist, but the ability to anticipate and counter our movements with an efficiency we had never encountered. But it wasn't just the Germans who were forced to reconsider their assumptions. Within the Soviet command structure, a heated debate erupted that would rage for hours in bunkers and command posts across the Kursk salient. Marshal Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front, initially demanded Morozov's immediate court-martial for insubordination. His counterpart, General Vatutin of the Voronezh Front, argued for a different approach, one that would fundamentally reshape Soviet artillery doctrine for the remainder of the war. The turning point came when reports began filtering in from other sectors of the front. Emboldened by word of Morozov's success, artillery officers across the salient had begun making minor adjustments to their firing solutions. A battery commander north of Poniri shifted his guns 30 degrees to target a German assembly area his scouts had identified. Another, near Prokhorovka, delayed his barrage by 15 minutes to catch a Panzer column as it emerged from a tree line. Each small act of initiative yielded disproportionate results, creating a cascading effect that German commanders would later describe as the day the Russians learned to think. The transformation was not without its costs. Senior Soviet officers, schooled in the brutal lessons of 1937 when independent thinking was often fatal, struggled to balance the demands of military discipline with the growing evidence that rigid adherence to doctrine was proving counterproductive. Telephone lines buzzed with encrypted conversations between front commanders in Moscow, as Stalin himself was briefed on the developing situation. The dictator's response, characteristically blunt, would become legendary among Soviet artillery officers. If the method works, make it doctrine. If it fails, make it a court-martial. By midday on July the 6th, the ripple effects of Morozov's unauthorized barrage had reached the highest echelons of both armies. German commanders, their confidence shaken by the unexpected precision of Soviet counter-battery fire, began implementing more conservative advance protocols. Panzer divisions that had been ordered to push through Soviet defenses at all costs now found themselves bogged down in cautious, methodical advances that surrendered the initiative they had counted on to achieve breakthrough. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the tactical one. For 3 years, German forces had operated under the assumption that Soviet resistance, while fierce, was predictable. Russian artillery, they believed, was a blunt instrument, powerful but imprecise, capable of saturation bombardments, but lacking the sophistication for targeted strikes. Morozov's success shattered that comfortable assumption, introducing an element of uncertainty that would plague German operations for the remainder of the battle. Within the Soviet ranks, the effect was electrifying. Word of the thinking gunner spread through the communication trenches and field telephone networks like wildfire. Artillery officers who had spent months mechanically following firing solutions began studying their sectors with new intensity, looking for the patterns and vulnerabilities that might yield similar opportunities. The transformation from reactive to proactive thinking marked a fundamental shift in the character of Soviet resistance. The broader implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Soviet military doctrine, heavily influenced by the disasters of 1941-42, had emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Initiative was discouraged, innovation was suspect, and deviation from orders was often fatal. But Kursk was revealing the limitations of such an approach when facing an adaptive, technologically superior enemy. As evening approached on what would later be remembered as the first day of the Battle of Kursk's turning point, Lieutenant Morozov found himself at the center of a revolution he had never intended to start. His unauthorized firing pattern had done more than destroy a panzer column. It had demonstrated that the Red Army's greatest weapon might not be its artillery or its tanks, but the ingenuity and initiative of its soldiers when freed from the constraints of rigid doctrine. The stage was now set for the final transformation, the moment when doubt and experimentation would crystallize into a new understanding of warfare that would carry the Soviet Union not just to victory at Kursk, but all the way to Berlin. The week following Morozov's unauthorized barrage would fundamentally reshape not just the Battle of Kursk, but the entire character of the Eastern Front for the remainder of World War II. What had begun as a single act of defiance crystallized into a doctrine that would carry Soviet forces from the defensive bulwarks of Kursk all the way to the ruins of Berlin. The transformation was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was forged in fire, doubt, and the grinding calculus of survival that defined the Eastern Front. By July 8th, 3 days into Operation Citadel, the full scope of the German offensive's failure was becoming apparent to commanders on both sides. The Southern Pincer, led by General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, had advanced barely 12 kilometers against defenses that German intelligence had dismissed as typical Russian improvisation. The northern thrust under Field Marshal Walter Model had fared even worse, grinding forward at a cost that made even hardened Wehrmacht veterans blanch. At the heart of this unexpectedly fierce resistance lay a revolution in Soviet artillery tactics that traced its lineage directly back to Morozov's gamble. The transformation had not come easily. In the immediate aftermath of that first night's engagement, Soviet military bureaucracy had responded with its characteristic mixture of suspicion and calculation. A commission was convened, not to celebrate Morozov's success, but to investigate whether his actions constituted criminal insubordination. For 48 hours, as the battle raged around them, senior officers debated the fate of a lieutenant who had achieved what conventional doctrine said was impossible. The commission's deliberations revealed deep fissures within the Soviet command structure. Older officers, survivors of the 1937 purges who had learned that initiative was often fatal, argued passionately for maintaining rigid discipline. Today, it is an unauthorized firing pattern, one colonel testified. Tomorrow, it will be entire battalions deciding their own objectives. This is how armies disintegrate. Their arguments carried weight. The disasters of 1941 and early 1942 had been marked in part by poorly coordinated actions as unit commanders made desperate, uncoordinated decisions in the face of German breakthroughs. But a younger generation of officers, promoted rapidly to replace the massive casualties of the war's first years, saw something different in Morozov's action. Major General Pavel Rotmistrov, who would soon command the 5th Guards Tank Army in the climactic tank battle at Prokhorovka, argued that the Red Army's greatest weakness was not indiscipline but the opposite, an inability to adapt to battlefield conditions faster than the enemy could exploit them. The Germans have thrived, he told the commission, because their junior officers are empowered to seize opportunities. We have survived on courage and numbers. To win, we must learn to think. The debate was resolved not by military theory, but by battlefield results. As artillery batteries across the Kursk salient began implementing variations of Morozov's approach, observing enemy patterns, anticipating movement, adjusting fire based on real-time reconnaissance, German offensive momentum ground to a halt. By July 10th, Hoth's southern thrust had advanced just 25 kilometers, at a cost of over 350 tanks and assault guns. Model's northern offensive had effectively stalled, achieving local penetrations that were immediately sealed off by Soviet counterattacks. The numbers told a story that doctrine could not ignore. In sectors where artillery, commanders adhered strictly to pre-planned firing schedules, German forces achieved breakthrough rates averaging 3.2 kilometers per day. In sectors where gunners were authorized to adapt their fire patterns based on observation, the breakthrough rate dropped to 0.8 kilometers per day, and at significantly higher cost to the attackers. The correlation was impossible to dismiss, and by July 11th, new orders began filtering down from front headquarters. Artillery commanders were authorized to exercise tactical flexibility within operational parameters. The language was bureaucratic, designed to provide political cover should things go wrong. But to the gunners crouched behind their pieces, studying the terrain through binoculars and noting patterns in enemy movement, it meant something profound. They were trusted to think. The transformation rippled outward, affecting not just artillery tactics, but the entire Soviet approach to defensive warfare. Tank commanders began positioning their vehicles to exploit likely German avenues of approach, rather than simply plugging gaps. Infantry officers started preparing fallback positions based on observed enemy tactics, rather than generic defensive doctrine. For Lieutenant Morozov, now promoted to captain and assigned as an artillery instructor, the personal transformation was complete. The young man who had trembled with fear and doubt as he defied orders now found himself explaining his methodology to rooms full of senior officers. His unauthorized firing pattern had been dissected, analyzed, and systematized into a training program that would be implemented across Soviet artillery forces. What had been an act of desperate improvisation became Field Circular 4307, Adaptive Fire Control in Fluid Defensive Operations. The German response to this tactical evolution revealed their own transformation, from confident aggressors to increasingly desperate attackers. Radio intercepts captured the frustration of Panzer commanders who found their carefully planned assault routes suddenly interdicted by precisely timed artillery fire. "It's as if they can read our minds," one German battalion commander reported on July 12th, hours before his unit was shattered by a Soviet counterattack at Prokhorovka. "Every time we identify a weakness in their line, they've already anticipated it and prepared a trap." The Battle of Prokhorovka, fought on July 12th and often called the largest tank battle in history, represented the culmination of the transformation Morozov had initiated. Soviet artillery, operating with unprecedented flexibility and coordination, channeled German armor into killing zones, where massed tank formations and anti-tank guns waited in carefully prepared positions. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. Over 300 armored vehicles destroyed or damaged in a single day of fighting. But more significant than the numbers was what they represented, proof that the Red Army had evolved from a force that absorbed and endured German attacks to one that could anticipate, adapt, and counter them. By July 13th, Hitler ordered Operation Citadel suspended. The official reasons cited Allied landings in Sicily and the need to redeploy forces to Italy. But the operational reality was stark. The Wehrmacht had exhausted its offensive capability against a Soviet defensive system that had proven far more sophisticated and adaptive than German planning had accounted for. The Eastern Front, which had been characterized by German offensive operations for 2 years, would from this point forward be defined by Soviet advances and German retreats. The long-term implications of Morozov's unauthorized barrage extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Soviet military doctrine underwent a fundamental revision in the months following Kursk. The concept of mission-type tactics, giving junior officers clear objectives but flexibility in execution, was cautiously introduced into Soviet training programs. Artillery schools began emphasizing observation, pattern recognition, and adaptive targeting alongside traditional gunnery skills. By 1944, the Red Army that rolled westward across Eastern Europe bore little resemblance to the rigid, doctrine-bound force that had barely survived the German invasion of 1941. The transformation was not universal or complete. Soviet military culture remained deeply hierarchical, and the price of failure continued to be severe. But the lesson of Kursk, that initiative and adaptation could triumph over mechanical precision, had been learned at the highest levels. When Soviet forces crossed into Germany in 1945, their artillery tactics combined the massive firepower that had always been their strength, with a flexibility and sophistication that German defenders found impossible to counter. For the soldiers who had fought at Kursk, the memory of those July days remained vivid for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the moment when the tide truly turned, when the Red Army stopped merely surviving German offensives and began dominating them. At the heart of that transformation was a simple truth that Morozov had demonstrated, that warfare is not merely about following doctrine, but about understanding the enemy, anticipating their actions, and having the courage to trust one's own judgment even when it conflicts with orders. Lieutenant, later Colonel, Ivan Morozov survived the war and lived into his 70s, teaching artillery tactics to successive generations of Soviet officers. He rarely spoke of that night at Kursk, but when pressed, he would describe it not as an act of heroism, but of necessity. "I was terrified," he told an interviewer in 1978, "not of the Germans, but of what my superiors would do. But I had studied their patterns and I knew where they would be. The choice was between probable punishment and certain defeat. It wasn't courage, it was mathematics." That modest assessment understated the significance of what he had accomplished. In a military culture that had learned to fear initiative, he had demonstrated its value. In a doctrine that prized conformity, he had shown the power of adaptation. And in a battle that would determine the fate of nations, he had proven that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following orders, but in recognizing when those orders must be questioned. The burned-out hulks of German Panzers that dotted the fields around Kursk stood as monuments to that lesson. They were testimonies not just to the power of Soviet artillery, but to the transformation of an army that had learned to think, adapt, and triumph. From doubt to daring, from ridicule to respect, from rigid doctrine to flexible innovation, the arc of that transformation was written in fire and steel across the Ukrainian landscape, and it changed the course of history. The unauthorized firing pattern of a single Russian artilleryman had indeed destroyed a Panzer column. But more significantly, it had destroyed the myth of German invincibility and sparked a revolution in Soviet military thinking that would echo across battlefields for years to come. In the end, Lieutenant Morozov's greatest achievement was not what he destroyed, but what he created, proof that even in the most rigid of systems, the human capacity for innovation and courage could still change everything. The autumn winds that swept across the Kursk salient in September 1943 carried with them something more than the first hints of winter. They carried the whispers of a transformation that would echo across every front where Soviet forces fought. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Morozov, now wearing the gold star of a hero of the Soviet Union on his chest, stood before a classroom of artillery officers at the Kalinin Artillery Academy, his hands still bearing the scars of those desperate July nights. What he was about to teach would reshape how the Red Army conducted offensive operations for the remainder of the war. The room was packed beyond capacity. Officers from every front had been summoned to Moscow to learn what Soviet High Command was now calling adaptive fire doctrine, though every man in that room knew it by its unofficial name, the Morozov method. The transformation from court-martial candidate to decorated hero had been swift, but the real revolution lay not in one man's redemption, but in how his improvisation had become institutionalized across the entire Soviet artillery arm. The Germans believed we were incapable of thinking, Morozov began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. They studied our doctrine, predicted our responses, and planned accordingly. At Kursk, we proved them wrong, but not through superior firepower or better equipment, through observation, pattern recognition, and the courage to trust our own judgment. The assembled officers leaned forward, many taking notes, others simply absorbing the implications of what they were hearing. The numbers supported Morozov's assertion with brutal clarity. Soviet military intelligence had conducted extensive analysis of the Battle of Kursk, comparing sectors where artillery followed traditional pre-planned fire schedules against those where commanders exercised tactical flexibility. The results were stunning. Adaptive fire control reduced German breakthrough rates by an average of 74%, while increasing enemy casualty rates by 42%. Perhaps most significantly, it accomplished this without requiring additional ammunition expenditure or manpower. But the transformation extended far beyond simple tactical adjustments. The Soviet General Staff, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's direction, had begun a comprehensive revision of offensive doctrine that incorporated lessons learned at Kursk. Artillery would no longer be viewed merely as a preparatory tool for infantry and armor assaults, but as a dynamic system capable of disrupting enemy formations, channeling their movements, and creating opportunities for exploitation. The first major test of this new doctrine came during Operation Bagration in June 1944, the Soviet offensive that would shatter German Army Group Center and liberate Belarus. Artillery officers who had studied under Morozov applied his principles on a scale that dwarfed even Kursk. Soviet guns didn't merely bombard German positions, they orchestrated a symphony of destruction that anticipated German movements, sealed escape routes, and systematically dismantled the Wehrmacht's defensive coherence. Captain Alexei Volkov, one of Morozov's former subordinates who had survived the hell of Kursk, now commanded an artillery battalion supporting the 1st Belarusian Front's advance. His after-action report, filed on June 28, 1944, revealed how thoroughly the lessons of that July night had been internalized. We observed German radio traffic patterns suggesting a withdrawal from Bobruisk. Rather than bombarding their current positions, we calculated likely withdrawal routes and established kill zones along 3 major road junctions. When the Germans began their retreat at 0300 hours, our fire caught them in column formation. Estimated enemy casualties: 2,000 killed or wounded, 67 vehicles destroyed. The psychological impact on German forces was perhaps even more devastating than the physical casualties. Wehrmacht officers, who had spent 3 years learning to anticipate Soviet responses, now found themselves facing an enemy that seemed capable of reading their intentions. A captured German artillery officer, interrogated in August 1944, described the shift with bitter clarity. In 1941, we knew where the Russians would be because they followed their doctrine rigidly. By 1944, they were always where we didn't expect them, hitting us at our most vulnerable moments. It was as if they had infiltrated our command structure. The infiltration was not of men but of methodology. Soviet intelligence had learned to combine signal intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, partisan reports, and tactical observation into a comprehensive picture of German intentions. But the critical element, the component that transformed information into devastating action, was the empowerment of artillery officers to interpret that intelligence and act on it without waiting for permission from higher command. This represented a fundamental shift in Soviet military culture. The Red Army of 1941 had been paralyzed by excessive centralization, with junior officers afraid to act without explicit orders from above. The disasters of that year had been blamed on many factors: poor equipment, inadequate training, surprise. But the deeper problem had been cultural. Initiative was dangerous in a system where mistakes were often fatal, and where success without authorization could be as perilous as failure. Morozov's vindication had helped chip away at that culture of fear. When officers saw that adaptive thinking could be rewarded rather than punished, they began to trust their own judgment. The change was gradual and uneven. Old habits and old fears died hard. But by late 1944, the Soviet artillery arm had been transformed from a blunt instrument into a precision tool capable of extraordinary sophistication. The transformation extended beyond artillery to influence Soviet combined arms operations. Tank commanders began coordinating more closely with artillery. Observers, using real-time intelligence to identify opportunities for breakthrough, rather than simply executing pre-planned assault schedules. Infantry officers learned to recognize patterns in German defensive arrangements and adjust their tactics accordingly. The entire Soviet operational system became more fluid, more responsive, more dangerous. German attempts to counter this evolution met with limited success. They tried varying their radio procedures to mask their intentions, but Soviet pattern recognition had become sophisticated enough to detect anomalies that often revealed more than routine communications. They attempted to decentralize their own command structure to reduce predictability, but this often resulted in poorly coordinated defensive efforts that Soviet forces exploited ruthlessly. By the time Soviet forces crossed into German territory in January 1945, the transformation that had begun on a summer night at Kursk had reached its culmination. The Red Army that advanced on Berlin bore little resemblance to the force that had desperately defended Moscow in 1941. It had learned not just to fight, but to think, to anticipate, adapt, and overwhelm through a combination of massive firepower and tactical sophistication that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. Morozov, now a full colonel and chief artillery instructor for the 1st Ukrainian Front, watched the final assault on Berlin from an observation post on the Silo Heights. The coordinated artillery barrage that preceded the Soviet breakthrough employed every principle he had discovered through necessity on that desperate night at Kursk: observation of enemy patterns, anticipation of movements, precise timing, adaptive targeting. The result was a German defensive line that collapsed in hours, rather than the days or weeks it might have held against conventional bombardment. In the decades following the war, Soviet military theorists would analyze the Battle of Kursk endlessly, extracting lessons and codifying doctrine. But for the men who had lived through it, who had witnessed the transformation from desperation to dominance, the essential lesson was simpler and more profound. Warfare was not merely a matter of following doctrine or executing plans. It required the courage to think, the wisdom to observe, and the judgment to act when action was needed, even when orders said otherwise. The legacy of that unauthorized firing pattern extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory it achieved. It represented a fundamental shift in how the Soviet Union approached military operations, replacing rigid centralization with flexible execution, substituting blind obedience with informed initiative. The transformation was never complete. Soviet military culture retained much of its authoritarian character, but the space created for adaptive thinking at Kursk opened possibilities that would influence Soviet doctrine for generations. And so, the story of Lieutenant Morozov's gamble became more than just a tale of one man's courage or one night's success. It became a parable about the nature of warfare itself, about how rigid systems can be undone by adaptive thinking, how technological superiority can be overcome by tactical innovation, and how the courage to question orders can sometimes save armies and alter the course of history. From the smoldering ruins of Kursk to the shattered streets of Berlin, that lesson echoed across the battlefields of the Eastern Front, a testament to the power of human ingenuity in even the most mechanized and brutal of wars.